friends, and welcome to the second episode of the Clay Taxidermy series. In this class, you're going to learn how to finish your jackalope, which we started together last class. I want to just remind you of the reasons why I'm having us all complete the same skill building activity. And the main reason why is because you'll learn techniques that will apply to creating many other different types of animals. So when you're choosing your own animal, you'll be able to think back to the techniques you've learned for the jackalope, and hopefully you'll be able to use some of those techniques while you're creating your final project. I want to remind you at this point that you have a lot of freedom. Although you're still working with these same steps, your jackalope does not need to look exactly like mine. So at this point, feel free to start taking some liberties and creating some more exaggerated features or adding things that I may not have added to mine, because although you're learning these techniques, it's still your project and you are still the artist. So I hope that this project and this skill building activity does help you think about what you're going to do for your final project when you get to choose your animal. And I hope that you enjoy creating this with me. So let's go ahead and get started. The first step we're going to work on in this second episode is creating the lower cheeks, or the jowls, essentially the jawline for our jackalope. We're going to begin by creating a small sphere, and then we're going to cut it in half with a wire tool and pinch each of those halves so that they are not thicker than your thumb. Once we've done that, we're going to check the sizing, and they should go almost up to the eye and then low enough so that it's creating a jawline just beneath the front cheeks that we've already added. Once we've done that, we want to work to smooth and blend that seam where they are almost touching the eye, and we need to be careful not to blend out that bottom eyelid as we're doing that. So I just went through and flattened those pieces out just a little bit and helped them to blend into the shape of the head a little bit more. We want the entire seam that stretches around the jowl that we just added to be really a smooth transition into the head. So I flipped my jackalope's head over so that I could really focus on blending this in so that there was no longer any type of seam left over. We want this to be one smooth transition into the face shape. Once your jowls are blended in nice and smoothly, we're going to begin creating the patch of fur that is essentially the neck or the chest that's reaching out from the wall to create this taxidermy jackalope. So as you can see, I started out with a piece that was clearly too large, so I just used my needle tool to scrape away some excess clay, to trace a smaller shape around it, and then to just work on carving out that piece until it fit my head correctly. Because this piece is clearly bigger than our thumb, it's very important that we hollow this out and then provide an air hole that will connect the air cavity of the head with the air cavity we're creating in this chest section. So as I was working to hollow this out with my loop tool, I made sure to leave a wall around the outside edge that was about the thickness of my pinky. And I did that so that I would have that space to help me score and slip and blend these pieces together. Then I measured how much I had left at the bottom by taking my loop tool, sticking it in, and then leaving my fingers at the edge so that I could see how deep my hole went and how much farther I needed to continue hollowing my piece out to make sure I didn't have any sections that were larger or thicker than my thumb. Next, I used my needle tool to create a hole that would connect the air cavity in the head to the air cavity in the chest that I just hollowed out. After deciding where I would like my neck or chest to attach, I traced where it lined up with the head with my needle tool so that I would know exactly where to add my score marks. Make sure that your score marks are deep enough that they'll be able to adhere to the other score marks on the piece that you're joining with. And don't forget to add the score marks that will go along the back side of your jackalope's head to connect with the back wall of your chest or neck cavity. After you are finished adding your score marks and your slip, you're going to take your two pieces and apply some pressure to help join them together. To begin blending these pieces together, I just very carefully went around and pushed from the side that I had more clay on, which happened to be the chest and neck area. So I took that clay and just used my fingers to gently start pulling it in to my jackalope's head so that it would be a nice blended transition. In some areas, like under the little chin that we created, I worked with a tool to help me blend those seams so that they were nice and smooth. After working really hard to blend the seam in the front of my project, it's equally important to flip your project over and work on blending the seam in the back to make sure that your structure is sturdy. I used a small coil to just help me fill in the gap that was left in the back, and I worked to just push that into that seam so that I wasn't trapping any air, and then blended it out so it was nice and smooth and flat. I chose to add a small coil in the gap on the side as well, just to help it be a little smoother from the profile view. Taking the time to blend this seam is what will make your structure sturdy. The next step is to create the ears, which means that you need to begin by rolling a slab that is 1/4 of an inch thick. I put my jackalope directly on the slab so that I could trace out shapes for my ears that I felt would fit my creature's head well. I used my needle tool to just trace out a general shape of an ear, and I didn't carve very deep at first so that I could change my design later. As you can see, there were parts of my design that I didn't like so much, but the great part about not carving too deep was that I could just use my finger to go back over the top of those edges and remove those lines completely. You can choose to use the template that I've created, or you can come up with your own ear shape design. However, you should keep in mind that if your ear is too tall, it might be difficult to make it stay attached to your jackalope's head. To create 2 matching ears, I just took the ear that I drew first, I flipped it over so that they would be opposite of each other, and I just traced it directly onto the rest of my slab to make sure that they were nice and even. After cutting out my ears, I made sure to blend away any imperfections that might have occurred just by cutting them out. So I spent some time blending just along those seams to get rid of any of those little lumps or pieces that were clinging onto the edges. For the next step, I made sure to spray my fingers with just a small amount of water so that I could really work on blending out the edge. Our goal with these ears is to blend the back corner of our entire outlined ear. So we want to keep the front corner nice and sharp because that's going to be the edge of our ear, but we want that back corner, so what we have on the back side of our slab, to be rounded and the front corner to maintain that sharp edge. As you can see here, I'm just using my fingers to kind of pinch along that edge to help round it out, and to continuously use slightly damp fingers to just press that corner down. After I had taken the time to go through and smooth out all of those back edges to make sure that I had gotten rid of any little cracks or lines, I took my thumb and started to press it into the middle of that ear. So just applying pressure to make it a little bit more of a scoop shape on the inside of the ear rather than just that plain flat surface. So I'm also working to kind of pull those outer edges up a bit to round that ear just a small amount. Once you've smoothed and shaped both of your ears, you're going to work on scoring and slipping them to your jackalope's head. Your ears are going to attach to your jackalope's head all the way back up against the wall, so I actually traced where they were going to go while my jackalope was laying flat and the ears were resting on the table. This is helpful just because then they are fully supported by the table while they're drying, and we don't have the issue of them starting to lean backwards and break away from the head. So I planned to just have them resting up against the wall and made sure to score and slip, applying very deep grooves to both sides, and then adding some pressure, wiggling it around to help those grooves adhere to each other. I used a tool to help me blend in the seam that was a little bit curved on the inside of that ear, just to help me reach a space that my fingernails might actually blend into or create little lines in. So I used just a tool to help me blend that seam. And then I used another tool to just help me blend the seams that were on the side of the ears and made a nice smooth transition into the head. Because these ears have such a small contact point and such a large amount of clay that's being attached, I chose to use a coil to help blend that seam in and provide a little bit more support and structure to keep these ears from falling off or cracking. So I worked to blend that coil into the head as smoothly as possible, and then I actually used the back of my fingernail to blend that coil out into the flat surface of the ear. I waited until after I had added that front coil to lift up my animal, because otherwise that ear might just fall off, so I gave it that extra support and structure before I attempted to lift it up and blend that back seam in any way. Take some time to really work on blending both the sides and the back of your jackalope's ear to help prevent it from breaking off. Next, you'll carefully complete these same steps on the other side, and as you're working, be careful not to bump or lift your jackalope's head too suddenly, because that first ear might still become detached. The next step is to begin creating the antlers, and to do that, I rolled a coil that was a little bit smaller than the thickness of my thumb so that I wouldn't have to hollow it out. I also just measured, compared to my ears, your antlers really shouldn't go too much taller than your ears, so I tried to make it just a little bit shorter than my ears were. So I took that coil and then I rolled the end of it to make it nice and skinny at the end. So I made it a very slow taper to that point. We want to have two antlers that match each other in the width and shape, so I used my first antler as inspiration on how to curve my second antler, and I also used it to help me size it out, so I lined them up together in the same shape and used that to help me determine the length of my second antler. Once I had rolled two even pieces for the longer portion of my antler, I decided to use that same piece of coil and to roll out two shorter pieces that would then attach to my larger antler. And I shaped my larger antler so that it was almost the shape of an S, and at that bump that's in the middle is where I plan to attach the shorter antler, like you see here. Before I attached it, I went through with the side of a needle tool and I scraped just along that outside edge all the way around, and what this is doing is giving that surface just kind of an angular look, which is similar to the texture that you might see on an actual antler. So I just took the side and scraped along, and I did that to create the antler texture, but also to get rid of any other imperfections that might have been on that coil. After I had scored and slipped the smaller piece of the antler onto both of the bigger pieces of the antler, I tried to just arrange them on the head, and I planned to score and slip them right in the center, so between the eyebrow and the ear, so just right in the middle of the head there. So I scored and slipped both of them, and I planned the angle that I was going to have so that they were nice and even, both sort of tilted in and then outward with the top of that antler. And then I used a tool to help me blend it into the head and just get that original blending done to help it become one cohesive piece. The scoring and slipping process, and most importantly the blending afterwards, especially for these attachments when we have something that is extending out from the head such a far distance, is incredibly important, because the chance of these leaning backwards or breaking off as they're drying is really quite high. So we are just being very careful in the way that we're attaching them. I went through and just made some small adjustments to make sure that my antlers were nice and even and symmetrical compared to each other. The chances of these antlers breaking at the seam where we attach them is really high, so to help provide some extra support, I created a small coil that I then wrapped around the entire base of this first antler. And as I wrapped it, I made sure to press into the antler and the head to help make sure that I was creating a nice sturdy support. You'll do this for both antlers, and then I went through and used the side of a tool just to help me blend that edge out into the head to make a nice smooth transition. So this is similar to the attachments that you'll see on other animals that really do have antlers, like a deer has little spots just right at the base of their skull where their horns or antlers do actually grow out of and connect to their head. So not only is this providing some support, but it's also a slightly realistic detail, although this animal is fictional. Once both of these areas are blended into the head nice and smoothly, you're going to just spray your fingers with a little bit of water and blend them out just a little bit more. Then we're going to go through with a tool to just create some small vertical indents to make this section look a little bit more realistic. Don't forget to add this texture all the way around the little base of your antlers. Make sure to spend some time going through and doing some last-minute blending and making any small adjustments that you need to. The next and final step for this project is to go through and add the fur texture. So to begin, I used a tool and just started creating some sections or like patches of fur that had a point as the end. So rather than creating like a zigzag line as the edge of my fur, I tried to have each section end with a specific point. Then I used that flat edge to just go through and kind of scrape it away and indent those spaces so that the areas of fur that were on top looked like they were actually above the sections that were below, because I had pressed the sections below down just a little bit with that flat surface of my tool. To create the actual texture and marks for the fur, I used a tool and I started with creating a center line that led to the point, and then all of the other fur marks that were in that section led to that exact same point. And that's a really great way to add fur without making it look really messy with a bunch of overlapping lines or intersecting lines. We want all of our lines to be gathering into one pointed section, which is typically how you see most fur. Once I finished the fur on the neck, I started working on adding the fur to the face as well, and I created some fairly deep indents into the eyebrows and tried to make them angle out away from the center of the forehead. And we want to make these nice and random. We don't want to have them be perfectly placed. And the eyebrow dents should be fairly deep just to sort of disguise that bigger bump that we created with the coil for the eyebrow. Next, I went through and added some very lightly indented, very short little marks of fur on the bridge of the nose that were going perfectly vertical, so straight up and down. The fur that goes around the outside edge of your eye should be just like slightly curved around, just slanting downwards. And we don't want to go all the way up into the eye because that space has very short little hairs. I also took my tool and just went down the bridge or the side of the nose and had that slanting out towards the cheekbones, and then curved around the outside jowls, just trying to follow the shape of the head with the direction of the fur. Remember that all of the fur that's on the face should be made with very shallow, short indents, and then this is what it should look like in the end, with the fur just sort of wrapping around the shape of the head. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this second episode. I hope it was helpful and that you learned a lot of different techniques and that you enjoyed making your jackalope as much as I enjoyed making mine.